The makeup of Minnesota's population is changing rapidly. It's becoming older and more racially and ethnically diverse. By 2020, Minnesota will have more adults over the age of 65 than school-age children for the first time in our state's history. And the aging of our society will affect our state for at least the next 20 years. In 1980, people of color and American Indians made up about 2% of Minnesota's population. Today, they are over 19% of our population, numbering over 1 million individuals. And that growth is projected to continue far into the future. These dramatic changes will have a profound impact on every part of our society, our economy, schools, healthcare, housing, transportation, workforce, to name just a few. Somehow we must take these dramatic demographic changes into account as we plan public health services and build a healthcare system that'll be serving us into the 21st century. Today we're going to look at the demographic changes occurring in Minnesota and their implications for the future of our state. It'll be an interesting future, so please stay tuned to today's episode of A Public Health Journal to learn more about where we are headed.
Welcome to A Public Health Journal, a program that explores public health issues facing our society today and tomorrow. The host of the show is Dr. Ed Ellinger, Commissioner of Health for the state of Minnesota. A Public Health Journal is sponsored by the Minnesota Department of Health and the Hennepin County Human Services and Public Health Department, all working together towards the goal of healthy people living in healthy communities.
Welcome to A Public Health Journal. The increasing diversity and aging of our society is already having a huge impact on Minnesota, and those impacts will only increase over the coming decades. They are requiring us to learn some new cross-cultural skills and forcing organizations to look at how they will have to change to be able to meet the needs of a more diverse population and an elderly population. Today we're going to look at the magnitude of upcoming changes in Minnesota and discuss the implications of those changes on our society. Joining us in our discussion today is Susan Brower, Minnesota State Demographer. Susan became the State Demographer in February of 2012. In that capacity, she researches demographic trends and reports on their implications for Minnesota. Her work applies an understanding of demographic trends to changes in a range of areas, including the state's economy and workforce, education, health, immigration, and rural populations. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I always love having the State Demographer on because you bring lots of numbers, and certainly those of us in public health love numbers and population numbers in particular.
Yep.
But let's just start out, I think, for people who may not know about the State Demographer, tell us a little bit about your office, where it is, what do you do, and sort of how it relates to all of the other kind of state activities.
Sure. So we are part of the Department of Administration, and our role is to produce population estimates for each year that are related to some of the state funding formulas. We also make projections for the future so people can plan for what the population will look like in the next 50 years. And then we do a lot of work to look at how demographic trends may shape other economic and social trends in the future. And we have a fairly public role. We talk to a lot of people in a lot of different sectors, in the private sector, nonprofit sector, and in government, helping people understand how these demographic forces are shaping Minnesota.
Right. And certainly we're going to talk about two of the demographic forces. We're going to talk about aging and the diversification of our population. So I'm going to, in the first segment we'll talk about aging, the second we'll talk about sort of the changing racial and ethnic makeup of our state, and then in the third part we'll talk about the implications that those have. So let's start talking about the aging. And I've got a slide here that shows what's happening with the numbers in the state that you've provided us. Tell us a little bit about what's on this slide.
So this is showing what a normal pattern, if we look at the blue bars there, a normal pattern of aging has been for us historically. And typically in the last, 6 decades or so, we've added somewhere between about 50 to 100,000 additional older adults, those are people who are age 65 plus, to the state. But as you can see from the yellow bars, in this decade we will add close to 300,000 this decade, and next decade over 300,000. So more in these, just in these 2 short decades than the last 6 combined. So it's quite a change for us.
So these are the baby boomers, right?
These are the baby boomers moving up over that 65-year-old age mark. That's right.
It's pretty obvious. All right, so then the next slide shows sort of that increase compared to other age groups. And so tell us a little bit about what you're seeing here.
So this shows, the yellow line is showing you that aging trend again, just from a different perspective, just showing you the number of older adults who are moving up above age 65. And what's unique when we look at these age groups in particular, a couple of things. First of all, these age groups represent the main budget drivers at the state. So 5 to 17-year-olds corresponds to K-12 education, 18 to 24 to the higher ed population, and then 65 plus, you know, is kind of in health and human services, portion of the budget of the state. And so what's unique about this is that we'll see in the older adult population surpass the K-12 population for the first time in our state's history, and it's not that far off. It's by 2020, and it represents kind of a realignment of our population, of the composition of Minnesota. And it's important, I think, just to look at and think about how public budgets and public programs need to kind of realign to this new demographic reality.
Yeah, my guess is most people don't think of this in terms of budget terms, you know, like here, these are the cost drivers, but it really is, you know, where we spend a lot of money is in K-12 education and certainly in healthcare.
That's right, and it's not just the budget, it's at the community level too. Just what are the services, what are the things that people will need in their communities when they have a larger share of their communities that are older people.
Well, and the next slide shows that as people age, I mean, we're living longer, but we're also fairly healthy. So tell us what's going on in this map.
So we're fortunate in Minnesota to have long life expectancies. I think the recent numbers showed that we were second only to Hawaii in terms of our life expectancy.
And for men, we're the longest life expectancy.
Well, go guys.
Yeah, I know it. It's a good state for men.
That's right. But this shows a healthy life expectancy. And people who are 65 can expect to live on average an additional 15 years that are disability free, which shows that there's quite a bit of time there after that 65-year-old age mark where we can expect that the boomers and others coming behind them will have a lot to contribute.
Yeah, and certainly it's that, you know, talking about the implications, 20 years of life expectancy, 15 years of healthy life expectancy.
Yeah.
So those last 5 years of more disability-focused life that cause a lot of concerns. You know, what do we do with folks? You know, can they live independently, and what kind of costs do they have?
Exactly. These are issues that we need to be thinking about right now, but they are a little bit off, because think about the baby boomers right now are reaching somewhere around age 70. They're getting close. The first baby boomers, many are still in their 50s, but there's a little bit of time until they reach those higher disability ages.
All right, and one last slide in this segment just really shows sort of the sort of a transition. It shows our population. Tell us what we're seeing here in terms of aging and the fact that the younger folks are a little different than the older folks in terms of makeup.
Right, so if we look at our population in Minnesota by age and by broad racial group, looking at populations of color there in the darkest blue part of the bar, you can see that increasingly as we go down that age pyramid to the younger ages, we have a higher concentration of people of color that are our youngest and our cutest residents are the most diverse. You can see the 0 to 5 population there has a large share that are people of color. The baby boomers, there are people of color who are baby boomers, but a much smaller share, and older adults as well.
Right. Well, we're going to then shift into talking about the racial makeup of the state, but first we need to take a little break.
Sounds good.
We'll be back right after this message.
Over the course of 1 year, our nation can experience dynamic changes. And there are many ways to measure changes in a vibrant nation like ours. By collecting information on our population, geography, and economy. The American Community Survey shows us who we are and how we're changing. The U.S. Census Bureau has been collecting information for our nation since 1790. Back then, and until very recently, these questions were asked of every household. But now, only a small percentage of randomly selected households are asked to participate. And of these randomly selected households, more than 97% agree that responding to these questions is beneficial to them, their families, and their communities. Your responses to the ACS provide the information needed to make improvements to things like transportation services, public health services, and our economy. Organizations use this data to help them identify the makeup of the American household. The American Community Survey is the only source for local comparable data. Businesses use this information to determine customers' needs. And employers use this information to plan job training programs and determine regional workforce resources. The American Community Survey lays the groundwork for our future, a future made possible by your responses and the statistics provided by the U.S. Census Bureau.
Welcome back. We're talking about the aging and the diversification of Minnesota society with Susan Brower, the State Demographer. Susan, let's now talk to the second big change that's occurring, and that's that we're becoming much more racially and ethnically diverse in addition to becoming older. And so we have a slide here that shows pretty dramatically what has happened over the last 20 to 30 years. And explain a little bit of what's going on in this slide.
Right, so we have seen a tremendous increase among our populations of color, and we see them broken down here by broad racial group, but especially since about 1990 that we've really seen a great deal of growth in those populations. We've seen just about equal growth among Asian Minnesotans, Hispanic or Latino Minnesotans, and Black or African American Minnesotans, that those populations have really grown very, very rapidly.
Yeah. But we've been a state of immigrants for a long time, but most of them have been Northern European or white. That's right. And now it's the color is a little different. That's
right. In 1950, 90% of our foreign-born, or over 90% of our foreign-born, came from a European country, and that's shrunk to just a small fraction of the foreign-born today.
The next slide shows the where people are coming from, sort of their background. I think people would be interested to sort of know what's the makeup of the populations of color and American Indians in Minnesota. So you can highlight here, certainly whites are still by far and away the largest, but then explain sort of what's going on with this.
Right, so these are the groups that we were able to identify from the census data that have some kind of indicator of a cultural boundary. And you can see here that African American, Minnesotans, Mexican, and Hmong are among the largest, but there are many, many others. And in fact, if we were to list every group, it would stretch down into the basement. We're seeing just the largest groups here, but really it's people who've come to Minnesota from all over the globe at this point.
All right, and then the next slide that we have really shows that this is a issue that is affecting all parts of the state. It's not just the metro area in terms of diversification. Explain what the green and the red mean on these two maps.
So on the left map, we're looking by county at the growth in populations of color. And this doesn't tell us about the size of the population, it's just telling us whether or not there has been growth in that county between the last two censuses, 2000 and 2010. And you can see that the vast majority of the state has experienced some growth in its populations of color.
So green means it's increasing.
It's increasing. Red means it's decreasing, which is pretty remarkable when you look at the second map on the right, which is our white non-Hispanic population. And you can see that there are large swaths of the state that are losing white residents as we age.
Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that the loss of white residents a lot of it is in the rural communities, whereas the growth of people of color is throughout the state.
That's right. And I think people tend to think when they think of population growth, they think to migration right away. Who's moving in and who's moving out? That's a part of it, but a lot of it just has to do with our age structure. Who are older Minnesotans? and we do have an older population in our rural areas.
Great. All right, and then the last slide really talks about sort of what I'm going to be talking about is sort of the implications of these changes. And this is about poverty by race, and tell us what we're seeing here.
So we see this when we look at income numbers, and you're looking here at the poverty rate, which is about $23,000 for a family of four, according to the most recent numbers, would put someone below the poverty line. And you can see that the rates of poverty are much higher among our populations of color, particularly our Black or African American population. When you look, compared to the white population where the poverty rate is 8%, it's 38% for the Black or African American. So a much different experience in terms of economic stability for our populations of color.
And also, aren't the populations of color much younger from our earlier maps, and aging maps? So that means there's a lot more children of populations of color, children of color that are in the poverty area.
That's right. So many of our births are coming from mothers of color, from parents of color, and that's the group, the young people in the state, in addition to populations of color that are most likely to be in poverty.
All right. Well, we're going to take a little break here, but I want to come back and then talk about the implications. Who gets these data, and what implications do they have for our education system, for our healthcare system, for all of those other kinds of systems that we have in our state. So we'll be back right after this message.
If you drive buzzed, it could cost you around $10,000. You'll face major legal fees, major fines, and steep insurance penalties. You could lose everything. Buzzed, busted, and broke, because buzz driving is drunk driving.
Welcome back. We're talking with Susan Brower, the State Demographer, about the changes that are occurring in Minnesota's population, and we're now going to talk about the implications that those changes have on our state. Susan, you have a lot of information. First of all, who do you share this information with? Decision makers, policy makers, people who, businesses. Who gets this kind of information, and what do they use it for?
We talk to a lot of people. We talk to people in state and local governments. We talk to people who are engaged stakeholders about the changes that we're experiencing. And then we talk to people in the nonprofit sector as well, and the corporate sector. So a lot of people get this information. We're really talking to pretty much anyone who will listen and who has an interest in it.
All right, so when you talk with them, what points do you make? What jumps out at you? Things that we really need to pay attention to?
I want people to understand that some of the changes that we'll experience with respect to aging and increasing diversity in particular are going to happen whether or not we are ready for them. I'm thinking of the aging trend in particular, that it will continue to play out no matter if we're prepared or not. And so that's something that we kind of have to come to terms with. The other issue with respect to diversity is we're going to continue to become more diverse regardless of what happens with immigration in the future. And so this is another change that we really need to be able to think about how to fully incorporate all of our current and future Minnesota residents.
Yeah, so these are forces that we really can't stop.
That's right.
Aging is going to occur.
Right, and it's not unique to Minnesota, and it's not unique to the U.S. This is just the outcome of the times that we live in.
Yeah. So what implications is it going to have for our economy? I mean, because that's what everybody's concerned about. At least in my world, they're concerned about jobs and they're concerned about health. So let's talk first about the jobs and the economy.
Yeah. So the immediate impact that we're already feeling is the exit of the baby boomers from the labor force. And we're already beginning to feel a slowdown in our labor force growth, which means kind of the number of people who are available to go to work each day. It's very, very difficult to grow very rapidly when you have a lot of people leaving for retirement. So the concern for our economic growth is that employers will be able to find the people that they need to fill the jobs. At the same time, we're going to have pretty big increases in the number of jobs related to healthcare because of the baby boomers. And so it's kind of a double whammy. We'll have more growth in sectors that require humans at the same time that we'll be experiencing this slower growth. So that's just one.
And don't the elderly, not just because somebody needs to take care of them, hasn't our economy been built on, you know, workers putting money into retirement and Social Security that then supports the elderly population? And that's going to be a smaller group of folks.
That's right. And so that's another budgetary issue that we'll have to come to terms with.
All right. And let's talk about the implications that increasing diversity will have. You know, we've had a state that has been pretty uniform for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden it's changing. And many of our policies and our social structures have been set around, you know, more of a homogeneous population. What kind of implications is it going to have socially in our state?
Well, I think when we look at the size of the disparities that we see in terms of income, educational attainment, in terms of health disparities, all of these things across our populations of color compared with our white non-Hispanic population, we need to seriously consider how we can improve the well-being of our populations of color. These are, you know, the growth is coming from populations of color in the state, and these will be our workers. These are already our children, and I just think as we continue to move forward, this is going to be a critical issue for all of our well-being in the state.
How do we compare with other states in terms, I know all states are diversifying, but are we coming at this a little bit later? And are there things that we can learn from other states in terms of how to address both the aging and the diversification?
So we are less diverse than the national average, but we've been increasing in diversity since 1990 at about the same rate. There are many metropolitan areas that are more diverse than we are, and many rural areas that are less diverse than we are. And so we kind of fall somewhere in the middle. We are coming to it a little bit late compared to some metros. It's just something that will move forward and hopefully figure out as we go.
Yeah, well, also what I've been struck with as I go around the country, we may not be as diverse in terms of total numbers, but we really have big pockets of special groups, you know, Liberians, Somalians, Hmong, that really make up a huge part of our culture. I think that's somewhat unique in Minnesota. Is that true?
It is. So we have a history of resettling refugees here in Minnesota, and it began with Southeast Asians in the late 70s or early 80s. And we had the community and the nonprofit and faith-based organizations kind of in place and ready to settle people, and that has continued as subsequent waves of refugees have arrived in the U.S.
Yeah. And I know you recently talked to the Rural Health Conference. What was the message that you gave them in addition to the numbers? What implications does this have, particularly for rural communities where they don't have necessarily the same level of resources and capacity to respond to some of these changes?
Well, I think it can be sobering and kind of daunting for some rural communities who are already experiencing difficulties finding caregivers. My message to that group was that it is likely to continue into the future, and this is something that's going to be a permanent change that we'll need to realign to. This isn't something that's just a temporary blip and then we'll go back to being young again. This is kind of how we expect Minnesota to be demographically from here on out.
Right. And what about your advice to the public health world that I'm responsible for?
You know, when I think about how we're changing and think about our health, you know, I really am concerned about the health that I see among some populations of color, particularly among those who have been in the U.S. for some time. We had a recent report looking at the rates of disability, including chronic health conditions, and just saw astronomical rates of disability among working age populations. So it's really at a very serious level, as you well know, but I think it'll continue to be a critical issue going forward.
Well, the numbers that you brought certainly are challenging, but there is some opportunities for Minnesota to really make some changes and come into the 21st century with a new vigor, related to the population.
Absolutely.
So thanks for being with us. It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
And I'll be back with a closing comment right after this message.
I'll never forget the day our landlord called and said, "Read your lease. No pets allowed." My owner tells him my dog ate the lease, but that didn't work. And now I'm stuck in a shelter. But this pit bull is ready for a new crib. I'm loving, loyal, and play well with others. So don't be intimidated by all my muscles, because the biggest one I have is my heart. That's right, I said it.
Minnesota is a healthy state that has been consistently ranked in the top 10 in almost every health category. So when I give speeches about public health in Minnesota, I paraphrase Garrison Keillor's quotation, "Minnesota, where the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all our health statistics are above average." That usually gets a chuckle until I follow with the next line, "unless you're a person of color or an American Indian." Averages hide the fact that Minnesota has some of the greatest health disparities in the country. But given the rapidly changing demography of the state, our average health will go down unless we reduce those disparities. From a numbers perspective, it is basically a math problem. But in reality, it's a social justice problem. Not everyone is benefiting from the policy systems and programs that Minnesota offers. An increasingly large number of people, particularly of people of color and American Indians, don't have the same opportunity as the white population to thrive and be healthy. That's why the Minnesota Department of Health has made advancing health equity the main focus of its activities, and why the governor has made diversity and inclusion a focus of his administration. Achieving equity is the central challenge for our state. If we are to be a healthy and prosperous state, everyone has to have the opportunity to thrive. We have a great deal of work to do to achieve that goal, but I have confidence in the community spirit of Minnesotans to work collectively to assure the conditions in which all people can thrive. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you can join us again next time on A Public Health Journal.